Recorded Books presents India, 5,000 Years of History on the Subcontinent by Audrey Truschke, narrated by the author. Scholarly Conventions. I aim for accuracy and legibility throughout this book, and those twin goals have guided my choices of scholarly conventions. Regarding specialist terms, I shy away from specialist terminology when I can, eschewing terms beloved by experts but unintelligible to others, like Persianate and Islamicate. I also decline to use acronyms, which are somewhere between off-putting and maddening to non-specialists. And so I spell out the Indus Valley Civilization, rather than resorting to IVC. I also use the titles of Sanskrit texts, such as the Mahabharata, not MBH. I make small exceptions when the acronym is more common than the full name, as in the case of the RSS. Readers who want a more in-depth take on my vocabulary choices should see the historiography essay. For diacritics, many words in this book are transliterated from a rich plethora of South Asian languages, including Sanskrit, Tamil, Pali, Persian, Urdu, Hindi, Telugu, and Bengali. To be easy on the eyes, I forego diacritics, including for European languages. For earlier periods, I follow standard transliteration schemes, although with some variations to use familiar English spellings or for clarity. For names and spellings, regarding proper names of people in the colonial period and later, I tend to employ the transliteration adopted by the person in question, including for Dulip Singh, Sikdar, and Anandibai Joshi. For places, I use names and spellings in vogue at the time, and so I recount events in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras in British India. In the 21st century, these are Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, respectively. Similarly, I detail how Malik Ambar built up the central Indian city of Kirki, known as Aurangabad after the Mughal renaming. This practice results in multiple spellings of some places, depending on the time frame in question. This includes spelling Sindh with and without an H at the end. In some cases, spellings were just never standardized, and I do let small variations stand, spelling Kandahar, for instance, with a Q and a K at different points. I make an exception to the practice of adopting time-appropriate names for the Indus Valley Civilization, since we do not know what they called their cities or themselves, and so must resort to modern terms. For English words, I generally follow American spelling conventions. Regarding pronunciation, I pronounce Indian origin terms that have entered into English with an American pronunciation, saying Sanskrit instead of Samskrita. I pronounce Persian terms with Indo-Persian pronunciation, not modern Iranian pronunciation, saying Shahnama rather than Shahnameh. Regarding honorifics, I avoid them for historical figures, writing of Alexander of Macedon rather than Alexander the Great. William Jones sans his knighted title of Sir. Jinnah rather than Quaid-e-Azam, the great leader. Ambedkar rather than Baba Sahib, respected father. And Jyotirao Phule and Mohandas Gandhi by their respective given names rather than by their shared appellation of Mahatma, great-souled. Some may find this practice jarring or even disrespectful, although it is meant only to signal an appropriate critical distance. My goal is to understand the historical roles of flawed women and men in their times and places, and I find positioning those people on pedestals ill-suited for such an endeavor. My non-honorific preference also applies to religious figures, such that I tend to write of Nanak and Jesus, rather than Guru Nanak and Jesus Christ, respectively. Notably, when I write about such figures here, I do so pursuant to excavating the histories of specific religions in South Asia, especially through the ideas and actions of practitioners. As a historian, I do not and cannot give credence to theological claims. Accordingly, I speak of deities as part of Indian intellectual history and without veneration, writing of Ram, Allah, and Krishna without further qualification. I make small exceptions to these guidelines and include honorifics when not doing so would likely cause confusion. For instance, I refer to the Maratha warrior king Shivaji rather than Shiva, which is more commonly the name of a Hindu god. I also write of the Prophet Muhammad, since there are many Muhammads in Indian history. Regarding dates, I give all dates in the Gregorian calendar, since it is by far the most common calendar used worldwide today. I always use the acronym BCE, meaning before Common Era. I only use CE, Common Era, upon first usage, or where there's a likelihood of confusion. I strive to give dates instead of or alongside reference meaningful only to certain groups of scholars. For instance, South Asia-focused archaeologists may all know when the Neolithic period began on the subcontinent, but most scholars who work on later periods do not. Likewise, I can recite Mughal regnal dates in my sleep, but I would not expect Akbar's rule to immediately anchor a Vedic specialist, much less a more casual reader of South Asian history. Regarding quotes. In quotes from primary and secondary sources, I often adjust spellings, grammar, and italics, and omit diacritics for the sake of consistency and readability. I also sometimes introduce glosses for clarity. For English medium primary sources, I retain older spellings when doing so does not compromise intelligibility. I often cite to translations of primary sources for wider accessibility. Regarding citations, some pre-modern Indian names lend themselves to the modern Western convention of citation by surname, and others do not. I use and alphabetize as appropriate to the specific name. I do not awkwardly force South Asian names into Western conventions. And so, for example, I cite Abu Fazl under A, but Swami Vivekananda under V. Most sources are listed in the bibliography, with one big exception and one small exception. In the last few chapters, I cite to many contemporary news sources, and I often include full citations in the endnotes. This avoids the awkward question of whether such sources are better.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.